Hi, this is Thomas Gray. I've found that a lot of people have curiosity. They're wondering why I came to Bolivia. A lot of Bolivian people are trying to move to the U.S. And here I am, a U.S. citizen living in Bolivia, and that's kind of baffling to many people. So I want to make this little video here to try to explain the main reasons why I came down here. The first area that really moved me to move to Bolivia is there were a lot of negative changes in the U.S. industry. I worked as a mechanical engineer in the U.S. for a number of years. I enjoyed my job for the most part, especially when I got to work on an interesting project, and not so much when I got assigned a routine project, but it was a low-pressure job with fairly long-term goals, and I had good supervisors. They were good engineers. They were experienced design engineers themselves, so they understood the work and understood me, and they were very helpful and supportive. I had good pay, good work hours, and a nice house in a nice city near forests and rivers that my whole family enjoyed. However, the culture of the industry changed in the 1990s, partly due to changes in the laws and partly due to new fads of operation, and I felt that I had to leave. I'll explain basic areas that I mean when I'm saying that I had to leave. The first area was regarding the changes in liability laws. This was the most serious problem. The previous laws that the U.S. had were designed to protect consumers from a manufacturer that was negligent. If a consumer was injured by a product that a manufacturer knew was dangerous, and the manufacturer did not warn of that danger or try to mitigate it, then the manufacturer could be judged to be liable and would pay the injured customer for the damages and also would pay some kind of appropriate penalty for the crime of negligence. However, people who were damaged by a dangerous product often found it was difficult to prove that the company was negligent. The manufacturer often could afford the best lawyers and the best legal processes, and it was difficult to prove that the manufacturer actually knew about the danger. So it was decided to make companies liable, regardless of whether or not they were proved to be negligent. New liability laws were passed that judged a manufacturer to be liable if a product caused an injury and if there was something feasible that the company could have done that would have prevented the injury, but they did not. It did not matter anymore if the manufacturer did not know about the danger. These new laws brought greater risk to manufacturers. At any time, a product might be misused in a way that they did not imagine, and it might cause a serious injury or death, and the company would be forced to pay millions of dollars in damages. So manufacturing companies were forced to protect themselves with liability insurance. They also began to adopt policies that they would avoid confessing that there was any problem. Because, you see, if a company stated that one of their products had a problem, lawyers would come running to find people that had been damaged by this problem, and the company might have to pay a lot of money just to defend itself in the court. And of course, it would have to pay a lot more if it lost the case. Now, this situation put engineers in difficult situations, and that was my position. If an engineer was studying the product, one of the products his company made, and he found some kind of a problem, he was told to be quiet. Maybe he could make some quiet changes called product improvements and hope that no one was ever damaged by the problem. If someone were damaged by the problem, the engineer was also told to keep quiet, not to admit that the product actually caused the damage. So, if an engineer warned the public about the danger, he was exposing the company to huge penalties and could be viewed as the one who caused the company to lose millions of dollars. And he could lose his job and possibly also his career, since no one else would want to hire a person who is that kind of an engineer, maybe. On the other hand, if the engineer did not warn the public, he might feel responsible in his conscience for allowing someone to be seriously injured or for allowing someone else to be blamed for the injury. In the well-publicized GM ignition switch problem, several people were killed because of a defect that caused the car's steering and brake power to be turned off. At least one of the GM engineers knew about this, but did not tell the truth to the public. That would be a very difficult situation, and I'm very glad that I never was in a situation of that magnitude, but I easily could have been. I had already made my decision to tell the truth, and that meant that I was in a risky situation that could cause me to lose my job and my house. I decided to leave as soon as I could. Since it was a nationwide problem in all of the USA, changing to another company in the US was not a possible solution. All right, the second area that caused me difficulty was that during the 1990s, ironically, companies began to be more risk-taking about reducing the quality of their products. I'm not sure why this was in total, but maybe the companies felt like they were liable to lawsuits no matter what they did. So they might as well let the liability insurance take care of any problems and focus on making more money by making the product cheaper. This also caused some problems for the conscience of an engineer. A design engineer often chooses that career because he wants to design a good, long-lasting product. If he is told that he has to make the product weaker to save a small amount of money on each unit sold, he feels like he is going against the purposes for his career, for which he chose that career. And in some cases, the weaker product could actually cause injury or death. An engineer who knew that he could have made the structure strong enough to prevent that injury, but did not to save his company money, he might feel very responsible for that and have a problem in his conscience. In my case, I was ordered once to make a protective guard weaker to save $1 per unit. I refused, at the risk of losing my job. They did an in-house test that failed with the weaker guard, and they rescinded their order and let me make the guard stronger. In another situation, I invented a new kind of guard structure that analysis indicated would be extra strong at a cheaper cost, but I was told I could not make that guard because it looked too different from the original concept. I felt very bad about both of those situations and those incidents, and that confirmed to me I was in an unpleasant and even a dangerous situation that I needed to escape from soon. A third area regarded the laws about offensive speech that were being passed. There was a new law called the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was supposed to protect handicapped people from discrimination and problems. It was passed by the U.S. Congress in 1992, and it made it illegal to use offensive speech. Obviously, the idea was it would protect people from getting insulted because they were deaf or because they were lame or had some other problem, but it was not specified to that kind of thing. It basically said if anyone was offended by speech that they had just overheard at work, they didn't even have to get this told to them. They just had to overhear it at their workplace. And all they needed to do was to report to a judge that they had had an offensive speech used against them. The case could be brought against the speaker just on that basis. And it was not necessary to inform the person who made this offensive comment. It wasn't necessary to ask him to stop using it. All they had to do was bring the case to a judge, find 5 witnesses of the same background as the offended person who would agree with the offended person that the speech was offensive, and the offending speaker then was guilty and liable for a substantial fine. At that point, if the company where the person works failed to stop him from using that offensive speech again, the company would be held liable for much greater fines. The lawyer told us the company would have to pay millions of dollars versus only thousands for the individual. The lawyer told us directly that any person who continued to say the offensive things would probably lose his job to protect the company. This told me that we had lost our right to free speech in the USA. There was another danger that threatened the loss of my job, since I knew that some of my views might be offensive to someone who overheard me. If I lost my job for any of these 3 things, I would probably not be able to get another job. And I would not be able to pay my mortgage payments, and thus my wife, my children could become homeless. I was in a dangerous situation, and I could see I needed to escape. All right, another thing happened that wasn't quite so dangerous, but it was also threatening the loss of a job and making the work situation very difficult. Our company began to change the work structure. Before, we had supervisors that set our goals in conjunction with the upper managers, and they began to require each employee to formulate his own goals. Okay? With the previous situation, the supervisor took the responsibility of making sure that we were doing the right thing, and it was our job to simply do those things. But then when the goals were set by the employee, he had consequences for achieving those goals or failing to achieve the goals. The worker was expected to constantly improve his goals and his performance. They grouped workers into teams in which each member of the team was expected to debate and negotiate plans with the other team members. This required time-consuming meetings according to certain procedures that took time that before we had used to do our work. The team meetings were supposed to result in higher performance, so we had to work faster when we were not in the meetings. My design engineering job, which had been a very low-pressure job, began to be a higher-pressure job. Another thing was that the individuals were no longer valued in this new culture. If someone had done an exceptional job or had made a new invention, he was not rewarded by similar assignments with higher pay and responsibility. He only got rewarded according to his predefined goals. And what happened in one case, at least, was that a prominent employee objected to this new work structure, and he was taken off the team and given a menial job, even though he had been a very successful engineer and he was a supervisor, really near the end of his career, near retirement. He had several decades of successful experience, and they just put him off on a menial job, taking care of some kind of a secretarial work. Another thing that bothered me was that the methods and tools were often defined by a special team assigned to that task. And the team was often a group of young new engineers with no experience. And the experienced persons, they were not consulted. They just said, you have to use these tools, you have to design it in this way. That was very difficult. And the employee morale became very low. It was not just me. Employees often felt emotionally sick at work. The ones that I knew that I talked to. Older employees who could retire early did that. I remember one guy coming back and saying, "It smells like death here." I decided I could not continue, and so I turned in my resignation with 9 months' notice. This was after going through this for several years and trying to get ready in appropriate ways. And other employees, like I said, expressed their distress to me and publicly sometimes. Two of them actually said they wanted to quit like I did. One guy came to me and says, "I wish I had the courage to do what you did." I wanted to make it clear that it wasn't just me. There are a lot of people suffering, and I think they're still suffering today. Another general area of problem was in the declining social, economic, and political situation of the United States. The United States government is in serious debt trouble. You can look on the internet and find this out for yourself. It has laws that pay for medical care for old people and disabled people, and health care costs have increased and continue to increase. And it's such a big problem that the health care payments for the old and disabled people use up about half of all the taxes collected. And this percentage continues to rise. The existing debt requires interest to be paid, and that interest amounts to about a quarter of the tax money. So this leaves about a quarter of the tax money receipts to run the government, and that's not enough. Surprise, surprise. Therefore, the government is required to borrow more money each year. This makes the problem accelerate because this increases the interest payments. When this gets to the point where the part of the taxes not used for medical expenses cannot cover even the interest payments, then those who hold the bonds that lend the money to the U.S. government will probably ask for their money back. I understand that this could collapse the economy of the United States with my limited economic knowledge, but it seems to me like that is the way it it is inevitably going to happen. That collapse might have already happened, except the interest rates have been lowered to a very low value. If the interest rates raised significantly, or if tax revenue decreases when people lose jobs or take jobs with lower salaries, the U.S. government could quickly collapse. I thought it would happen soon. That's another reason I wanted to move out of my dangerous situation, coming from my job situation and also having a mortgaged house. So that's what I did in end of 1997. Well, 20 years have passed now, almost, and even with the problems of 2001 and 2008, it still has not completely collapsed. So it looks like I was an alarmist and I exaggerated the problem. However, I don't think it can go on forever, and I don't think any reasonable person would think it will go on forever, just like this. So I was able to sell my house and use the money to make an orderly move, get a house in Bolivia with no mortgage. And my wife is from Bolivia, so my move was easier than it would have been for other Americans probably. But it's harder now than it was when I made my move for different political reasons. I often have hoped and tried to become less dependent on earning money, and I've not been completely successful at that, but I think I've made some good progress, and I do feel the situation in Bolivia is safer. The U.S. food situation is bad. Huge companies make most of the food in the U.S., and the quality is not good, especially with the genetically modified products and chemicals added in the growing, harvesting, and packaging of the food. Agricultural soil has lost its fertility and healthy components. That's a problem that's been going on for over 100 years, and they've warned about this, and they've done nothing about it. So it requires the use of artificial fertilizers to keep producing deficient food. It doesn't have the minerals that the food used to have. This is not good. And I think my health is better in Bolivia because the situation is not so bad here, even though it's not perfect either. And in the U.S., the economy and regulations make it quite difficult for a person to grow all of their own food. For many people. Some people probably could, but it's kind of difficult. Okay, and I had the other problems too. The food grown on huge farms the farms are located in the center of the country. And that means that the food has to be transported to the population center, primarily the East Coast borders there in the New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia area, and also on the West Coast, Los Angeles, Seattle, and those other places. And they're very vulnerable if there's any disruption of transportation. And on top of that, the transportation infrastructure, especially the bridges, is getting old and is in very bad condition in many cases. That was a big theme during the recent elections in 2016. And there doesn't seem to be enough money to fix them. Another danger is the threat of war. There's threats constantly about this, nuclear threats. Besides terrorist attacks, there's some countries that seem to want to destroy the U.S. And like the threat of the economic collapse, this has been discussed for many years, so it seems like it will never happen. But we cannot depend on it not happening. There's also threats of natural disasters, like several major earthquakes are predicted that seem to be overdue according to the historic timetables. Another area is that the social and moral and spiritual situation in the U.S. has continued to decline. I didn't want to send my children to the public schools in my neighborhood when I lived in Portland, Oregon, and I didn't see any other option available to me at the time due to a lot of situations that I don't want to get into detail to make this short as we can. And so my oldest son was getting into the age in 1997 where he was supposed to be enrolling in school. And I either had to do something about that, and I didn't have too many options. So coming to Bolivia, where I knew there were some schools available that I thought were going to be good, I decided I need to get this move done quite soon. Now, I understand the situation in Bolivia and the rest of the world is also bad. But I think the problems here are more easily solved for the long-term future. The problems for which I left the U.S. have not been reduced, but have increased from what I understand, what I've heard. And the economy is now worse than when I left. So moving back to live in the U.S. is not an option for me, unless something very dramatic changes, which I don't see happening. And I don't recommend people moving to the USA. I don't recommend Bolivians where I live now moving to the USA, even though that seems to be the greatest dream of many people. Unless you have some very difficult situation here in Bolivia that requires urgent change, and there's an opportunity to get some relief from that in a temporary way by moving to the U.S. But I really urge people in Bolivia and in other parts of the world to use wisdom to solve the problems. Now, if you look at the U.S., it seems like there are a lot of advantages there that remain from the past, and it can seem like those advantages are a big improvement over life in Bolivia. But the future outlook is not good for those advantages. Now, I thought it was going to be worse than it is, and so that everybody's going to say, well, you're an alarmist. You're just being a pessimist. But more and more people are sharing my viewpoint. It's not just me. And some people have just told me that they're afraid to move out. They don't know where else to go. Well, I advise those people, find another home, if possible, in another part of the world. I do recommend doing something with a group of people. If you have trusted friends or family, and look for something. Don't just sit there seeing things get worse. But people feel like they can't do it. If it's not an option to move out of the U.S., try to do something to make changes. And I recommend that everyone ask God, our Creator, for help and guidance. That's basically the situation as I see it. Thank you for listening.